I think we'll give everybody about, what, 5 minutes, Melissa, just to log in.
I would just wait a couple of minutes.
Yeah.
But we are live now.
Mm-hmm.
Looks like we have 8 participants right now.
Okay. Yeah, I don't see participants.
It's down on the bottom of your screen.
There we go. Okay.
Okay, it looks like we're starting to stabilize.
Mm-hmm. See, I think we're missing Stephanie.
It's okay. You can start without.
Okay. Okay. Then, yeah, it's about 2 minutes after, so I guess it's time to get started. So, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 2022 Executive Compensation Guidelines Adoption Meeting. My name is Adrian Owenby. I am the lead staff for energy safety on the Executive Compensation Guidelines. Next slide, please.
And I'll just note that the slide says, the first slide says March 14th. So we're a month off. It's February 14th, everyone.
Yes. Oh, well. That's when your executive compensation submissions are due. That's probably why. So the meeting agenda is, first we're going to do a very brief safety message and move directly into public comment. After the public comment, I'll do a high-level overview presentation of the new 2022 guidelines. It changes from 2021 to 2022, and also briefly discuss changes from the draft that we released in December of 2021 to the current version. And then we'll move on to the formal approval, and Melissa will have some things to say at that point. Next slide, please. So very briefly, it's a safety message here. We want to remind you all to beware of your surroundings, to stay hydrated and cool. Know your evacuation route or routes. I don't know that the meeting is going to last long enough for you to have to worry about standing up and moving around, but it's always a good idea for longer meetings. And we want to remind you all to practice your public health guidance if you're as appropriate, social distancing or masking as appropriate. And we also want to remind you all to say something if you feel something. So let us know if there is a crisis going on. Next slide, please. So if you want to make a comment, please raise your hand and you will be unmuted. The amount of time we have for comments may become limited based on the volume of comments. If it looks like we're going to start to run over, we will put a timer on the comments. But right now, if you have any, if you'd like to make any comments, please go ahead and raise your hand. And James will unmute you and you can make your comment.
Public comment is available to stakeholders as well. It's
yes.
not just limited to members of the general public.
Mm-hmm.
There's currently no hands raised. I will point out that there is the Q&A function, I guess. I believe you want to have them use that if they'd like to type a comment. But,
yeah, if you'd like, you can always type a comment as well.
Yeah, but
Q&A.
The raise your hand feature should be available to you, but there's currently no hands raised.
Yeah, I see no hands either. Well, I think in that case, if no one is willing to indicate they would like to make a comment, we can go ahead and move on to the presentation. So go ahead to the next slide, please. So we're talking about, this is going to be a high-level overview of the guideline changes. We're going to talk about the required information template, which is new. The guideline definitions we'll go over just very briefly. The metric classifications will go over fairly briefly. And then we'll have a brief wrap up where I hit on a few last items and move to Melissa for her decision. Next slide, please. So two main points I'd like to make in this high-level overview is the submission requirements are now kind of structured to increase the consistency and the uniformity of the submissions that we receive. I want to note here, and I'll note it again later, this is not the same as, in no way requires consistency and uniformity in the actual systems themselves, just in what you're reporting and sending to energy safety. The submission requirements are also now all structured around the statutory requirements. Next slide, please. So the comments we received on our December 2021 draft guidelines included a number of questions and requests for clarification. And we've incorporated the answers to those questions and those clarifications into the proposed final 2022 executive compensation guidelines. The other more substantial change that we made is to section 6 perquisites. It's been renamed to indirect or ancillary compensation to more directly align with the statutory provisions. And we've added 2 additional questions regarding supplemental retirement plans to that particular section. Next slide, please. There are 7 sections in the attachment. 1 here, which is the required information template. We include at the start of each of those a rationale that includes a reference to the relevant statutory provision. And we have in each of the sections examples in bold green text. We want to note here that for submitters, you should make sure to go ahead and delete all of the example text and examples that we provide when you make your submission. The previous guidelines that we had were, I think, about 4 pages long. The proposed 2022 guidelines are, I think, roughly 67 pages long at this point, and most of those pages are taken up by this required information template. Next slide, please. So the first 4 sections of the template apply to all electrical corporations' executive compensation submissions. The first section includes a single table breakdown of short-term and long-term compensation components. Second section covers the exclusion of executive officers and the rationale for that exclusion. The statutory definition of executive officer that this section operates under is somewhat porous, and this section is intended to provide us with data about who is or who is not considered an executive officer under that statutory definition. Section 3 covers the short-term incentive program and offers sort of a in-depth dive into the short-term compensation structure. It's the longest portion of the template, I believe. It's about 14 pages long. Section 4 deals with the long-term incentive compensation structure. And this is the second longest section, I believe, in the required information template at about a dozen pages long. Next slide, please. So the final 3 sections of the template apply to electrical corporations with any new or amended contracts for executive officers. Section 5 requires a breakdown of the base pay, short-term compensation, long-term compensation, and indirect or ancillary compensation components. Section 6, as I mentioned previously, now covers indirect or ancillary compensation and requests a breakdown of the various components of that compensation. Section 7 revisits the long-term incentive compensation structures in light of the relevant statutory provisions. Next slide, please. The second attachment is attachment 2, which includes the terms, acronyms, and definitions. We've defined 22 separate terms. This is an important section because it does provide you with key information and the methodology for calculating items such as total compensation, etc. Next slide, please. So the third attachment in the required information template is the metric categorization requirements. We're going to emphasize here again that this is only for reporting to energy safety. And once again, that this is not the same thing as, and in no way requires consistency or uniformity in the executive compensation structures that the electrical corporations develop. Okay, next slide, please. So just to wrap up here, we do have an electronic file naming convention for submissions, and we expect the submitters to adhere to those conventions. We have included an Appendix A that has the relevant code sections and past regulatory guidance for easy reference if you are interested in seeing that. And we want to let you know that all the files are going to be available through the docket log for docket 2022-EC. And with every intention in the world of having the latest files, including whatever is approved today, added to that docket before close of business today. So you should be able to find everything up to date by close of business today. And I think with that, I'm done, and it's time to move on to Melissa.
Great, thank you, Adrian. Before we move on, I just want to make sure and ask if there are any clarifying questions for Adrian.
Mm-hmm.
Please raise your hand or feel free to type in the Q&A. Okay, looks like hearing none. Can we go to the next slide, please? Oh, James, did you see something?
Sorry, that was the last slide on the slideshow that was given to me today.
Okay, well, then we can stop. Okay. We can stop presenting slides then.
Okay.
Okay. So we'll now move to the portion of this meeting where we consider adoption of the 2022 Executive Compensation Guidelines. For those who don't know me, I'm Melissa Semser. I'm the Deputy Director of the Office of Energy Infrastructure Safety. Before we get to the adoption phase, a little bit of background information. Energy Safety issued 10 days notice of this public meeting today on February 3rd, 2022, as was required by Government Code 15475.6. Government Code 15475.6 also provides that substantive changes to guidelines require 30 days written notice to the public and an opportunity to comment prior to adoption. The 2022 Executive Compensation Guidelines are substantially different than the 2021 Executive Compensation Guidelines. Therefore, Energy Safety released its draft 2022 Executive Compensation Guidelines on December 2nd, 2021 on the docket card with service to the service list and placed the draft guidelines on our website. Energy Safety provided a 30-day comment period to all stakeholders. Energy Safety received comments through January 3rd, 2022, and evaluated those comments to develop the final executive compensation guidelines here before us today. The final 2022 executive compensation guidelines do not substantially differ from the draft guidelines issued in early December. Energy Safety placed a redline version showing differences between the draft and final proposed 2022 executive compensation guidelines on our docket card on February 9th, 2022. Energy Safety has considered both written and oral comments in developing the 2022 Executive Compensation Guidelines, although we did not receive any oral comments today. The 2022 Executive Compensation Guidelines will enable Energy Safety to develop, as Adrian mentioned, a deeper understanding of utilities' executive compensation structures and allow for the ability to compare compensation structures across utilities. These guidelines today represent an important step towards continuing to drive safety in all areas of utility operations. One important note, the 2022 Executive Compensation Guidelines set forth the information that utilities seeking a safety certification must submit in order for Energy Safety to conduct its evaluation pursuant to the Public Utilities Code. These guidelines do not constitute approval of a utility's executive compensation structure. Energy Safety will evaluate individual utility executive compensation structures upon receipt of their submissions, which are due on March 14th, 2022. Energy Safety will also accept public and stakeholder comment on the individual utility submissions. The due dates for those comments are contained in the final guidelines. Now I'll move to the portion of adoption. The 2022 final executive compensation guidelines are hereby adopted. A clean version of the final guidelines, as Adrian said, will be posted to the website and to Energy Safety's docket card by February 15th. However, we'll strive to do that today, but at the latest, it will be there tomorrow. And that will conclude our public meeting today that was held in accordance with Government Code 15475.6. And with that, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you for your participation.
Thank you all.
Thank you.